Good evening. I'm John. I'm the bookseller at Literati, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore, and our event director. We're so pleased to welcome Oliver Uberti to our At Home with Literati series in support of Atlas of the Invisible, maps and graphics that will change how you see the world. We're so excited for this presentation this evening. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed to you, but you can keep the chat window open. So I'll be sharing links to purchase Atlas of the Invisible from Literati throughout the event. And live transcription is available on your toolbar should you need that. There's a closed captioning icon on the toolbar. And we do heartily encourage you to submit questions for Q&A using the Q&A feature of the webinar. You can submit those questions at any time. And of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, you can always find links to purchase books from Literati in the description directly below me. You can also like and subscribe to our channel to be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available on YouTube. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. Without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's special guest, Oliver Uberti. As a Los Angeles-based designer and former design editor for National Geographic. Additionally to that, he's a dear friend of the store who is in many ways responsible for so much of the branding you see inside and outside the bookstore, and that's helped make it what it is. So we're always pleased to support his latest projects. So please join me in welcoming into your living rooms, Oliver Uberti.
Thanks, John. Hi, welcome. I want to thank John for that excellent introduction and thank Hillary for the extremely kind review I spotted on Instagram a few days ago. And I want to thank all of you for supporting Literati Bookstore. Literati has been in my life, pretty much since they opened in 2013. I was living in Ann Arbor at the time, and as John mentioned, enjoyed collaborating with them first on some of the signage, the mural outside the store, and then later with Mike on our book, Notes from a Public Typewriter. And, even though I'm living in Los Angeles now, it's always nice to feel like Literati is my hometown bookstore. Even though I'm from Philadelphia, I've adopted Ann Arbor, where I went to school and where my wife is from, as my hometown. And so whenever I'm working on a new book, I'm always excited to come back and do a talk, a homecoming talk of sorts. So I'll get started here with a little screen sharing. All right, and away we go. Atlas of the Invisible is the third book that I've created in collaboration with James Cheshire, a geographer or a professor of geography at University College London. I serve as the graphics designer on the project, but also make a lot of the data visualizations, and we both research and write all the text together. So it's a full labor of love over all processes in the book's creation. And our first book together is called London, the Information Capital. And back in 2014, we were taking data from the recent UK census and using that to explore with all the data analysis tools that we then had at our disposal to look at what data can tell us about human life in cities. And we used London as our case study because London, we believed, was the most open city in the world in terms of sharing data, collecting data, and sharing it publicly. And then for our next book, we looked at all the data that biologists and wildlife researchers were collecting all around the world using GPS and other tracking technologies to follow the lives of individual lives and journeys of animals ranging from bumblebees to whales and mapping them on a global scale. And so then as we started thinking about a third book, we wondered if we could kind of combine the best of those first two books by looking at human behavior on a global scale. And as we thought more and more about what that would entail, we realized that For centuries, world atlases depicted what people could see: roads, rivers, and mountains. And we thought today, with all the computing power and data analysis power we have in the 21st century, we need graphics to reveal the invisible patterns that shape our lives. So, Atlas of the Invisible. Well, what do we mean by the invisible? There are many different examples of the invisible in our book. I'll just give you 4 to start. Invisible can be overhead. When we look up in the sky and we see a silver plane trailing a white plume, air travel can seem harmless, even pretty, but a darker truth is emerging. And so for this graphic, we looked at 11.2 million commercial flights over US airspace in 2019 and depicted each one of them with a black line, which created this smudgy charcoal drawing effect that I tried to reinforce by scanning in some charcoal paper and laying it underneath. The invisible can also be change over time. So data and maps give us the ability to take these slices of time and compare. So if we look at this light emission data recorded by NASA satellites, we can look at light emissions around the world in 2012, and we can look at it in 2016 and process it to compare how those light levels have changed. On this map, the turquoise and teal areas are parts of the world that have gotten darker between 2012 and 2016, and yellow are areas that have gotten lighter. So what jumps out immediately here is the impacts of the war in Syria that quite literally can be seen from space. Just over the border in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq, you see yellow areas right up hugging that invisible line that we call national boundaries. And there were previously uninhabited areas that lit up and became yellow during that period as refugees from Syria fled across the border to camps that we've marked here with purple diamonds in Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq. The invisible can also refer to past events that have disappeared from view with the loss of a generation, or in some cases were deliberately kept out of view. In the case of secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War. Now, in the year 2000, President Bill Clinton declassified this data of bombing targets and all these missions flown by the US Air Force and its allies as part of a humanitarian gesture, because many of the bombs dropped in Southeast Asia during the war didn't detonate and were continuing to explode when farmers went out with metal detectors or equipment to till their fields, or children were playing in the fields of the region. And thousands of people have been injured or in many cases killed by this unexploded ordnance. So by making this data declassified, we can bring it to life in maps like these and help target demining efforts to go out and 1 square meter at a time rid the fields and forests of Southeast Asia of all these weapons of war. And the invisible can also refer to events in the future that have yet to happen. Especially, so we've got a whole chapter in the book devoted to climate change. And here's just one example of some scientists' models of how our air travel will become more turbulent 30 to 50 years hence. I've colored this map here on a scale from gray to vomity green. I'll get more into my color palette choices in a little bit because James isn't here tonight. So you're getting the designer's point of view, and I'll tell you a little bit about fonts I choose, colors I choose, layout grid, and all that nerdy design stuff. But first, I want to talk about creativity and unexpected connections and where some of the inspiration for this book came from. I always think of creativity as the ability to make those unexpected connections, to combine things in ways we haven't seen before. And to do that, James and I like to say we keep the well full. And that means for this book, which took us 4 years to complete, the first 2 years of that was spent doing more looking than actual map making or book page designing. So we were going to exhibitions and digging around in old libraries, looking for material to help us envision what this new book was going to look like. So we like to give a bespoke look to every new project. And one of the biggest influences on us was looking to an atlas made by 2 guys back starting in 1838 and completed 10 years later in 1848. And it was Alexander von Humboldt working with a cartographer and designer named Heinrich Berghaus. And together, they redefined what an atlas could be. So instead of atlases showing who owned what or what was where, they were more interested in questions of how the world works or why things are where they were. So why does a region's climate depend more on its wind patterns than its latitude? Or in this case, why do different plants grow at different elevations in different parts of the world? We also were looking to some graphics being made in the late 19th century, early 20th century by W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, and this one made by the Colored Women's Club of Michigan, which was an inspiration for us in a whole chapter we have in the book devoted to invisible inequalities. In this case, this pioneering work was being used to convince and persuade Congress to pass anti-lynching legislation. This is 100 years ago, exactly, back in 1921. And at the time, what they were doing here was showing in red, well, they were trying to show that despite what the Southern congressmen might have been saying, that lynching was a local issue and should be handled by the states, the Michigan map makers here wanted to show that no, it's actually a national issue. And the red numbers here correspond to lynchings from 1889 to 1921, and the black numbers represent congressmen who had previously voted against such legislation. But the Southern naysayers, they were kind of a lost cause. So the real aim here was congressmen like Kelly from Michigan, who they hoped they could shame into voting for legislation the next time it came up for a vote. Fortunately, 100 years later, lynching, quite tragically, quite stupefyingly, is still not a federal crime. But maps, continue to be a way that we can speak out against these injustices, make them visible, and continue to keep up the good fight. This map is just one of another in the late 19th century and the early 20th century that represented a real golden age, these handcrafted visualizations. And that started to give way in the early to mid 20th century as increasing emphasis on statistical detail and computer mapping began to take hold. And by mid-century, you started to get maps that looked like this, that were being generated by computers. This one is looking at, I think, elevation data in the greater Boston area. And it demonstrated a pretty key point in the evolution of mapping that gets us to where we are today and allows us to make the maps that we make today, demonstrating that maps could be generated by press of a button. For instance, like if you wanted to look at population data every 5 years for the Boston area, and you realize there was some mistake in it, or you wanted to change it from 5-year views to 7-year views, you have to draw all those maps all over by hand. Now we can just change a few lines of code and spit out some maps, giving us whatever frame we want to. I'll show in a little bit how I try and retain a lot of the handmade quality of the original books. So I combine both the speed and efficiency of what James can do with big data crunching while giving it a lot of this bespoke feel of a custom designed product. And there's a couple tools at my disposal as a designer that allow me to do that, to retain some of that visual style that we really saw in the golden age of late 19th, late 20th century. It comes down to some simple design elements like the typography, the fonts I choose, the color palettes I build, and the layout grid of the book page. And I'm going to show you a little bit of my inspiration, the 3 of those things on this book. So in all that looking I was doing in the first 2 years with James, one map exhibition at the British Library, I came across this map on the left, the detail of it, it's called the Navy League map. And I was struck by the sans serif condensed typeface that was being used for all the political labels, the country names and such on the map. I hadn't really seen maps using something like that before. I really loved that condensed black sans serif and thought that would be perfect for country names on this new, yet unnamed at the time, book I was envisioning. And I started looking at other Victorian maps, like the famous John Snow map, looking, that helped pinpoint the origins of cholera in the 19th century, and looking at, the mix of italics and sans serif and then different font for the street names. I started building out a style sheet of fonts that could be used to give some of this visual hierarchy and real like visual richness to any map. And on any book project, any map project I'm working on, ultimately behind the scenes, whether you know it or not, I have to build out a whole typographic style sheet that helps unify the entire project together. Because I really want to give you a visual diversity from page to page with forms and different types of charts and different map projections, different views of the world. But I also want it to look like it all came out of the same shop, that this isn't an anthology of maps made by different designers. This is all one unified project. And one way I tie it all together is by having the same typographic classifications for every continent label, every country label, different labels for cities, even down to how I style the equator or ice fields. I got to come up with a defensible logic that all say hydrological features, use italics, for instance. Another tool in my kit is color. So to figure out this book's color palette, I was again looking in the archives of the LA Public Library, the British Library, looking at real richness in historical maps. They weren't all drab. You got these bright magentas and oranges and purples and teals on some of these early maps of Los Angeles. I was looking, of course, at color safe, color blindness aware color palettes to make sure that was always a consideration. Looking at Ellsworth Kelly and Paul Cezanne and other fine artists and their palettes, flipping through a West Elm catalog in the upper right. And of course, I've got all these color aid papers from my color theory classes in college still lying around, and I'll mix and match those to come up with different combinations. But then, it all comes together, and I realize that the biggest source of color inspiration for me is just the life around me in my garden in Los Angeles, and even the fiesta wear that we were given for our wedding. All these colors are just always in my field of view, and so they, by osmosis, start to make it onto my maps. Trying to get a range of dark hues and light hues, because one little thing that people might not be aware of when it comes to designing books is that these books, I hope, will be translated into international language editions. So far, there are, I think, 7 or 8 in the works. And to make it affordable for translation in these different markets, all type in the book, all type on the maps has to be black or gray. So that only the black plate in the printing press has to be translated. And the other publishers don't have to change the cyan, magenta, or yellow color plates in the book. So I have to come up with a color palette that allows all the labels for everything we do to work with just black or gray sitting. A couple other examples here. This gives you this next slide gives you a sense of, the division of labor in how any one map or graphic in the book gets made. So in the upper left, you see research, that turbulence graphic that I showed you earlier. This is how the data looked in the research paper from the scientist. And then James will take that data and we talk about what we want to do. Okay, we want to show it on the globe, some flight routes on it. And this is in the lower left, you get the export I get from James, the geographer, out of his cartographic software. And then I plop it onto my page grid, arrange the type around it, and build a key to help you understand what the graphic is showing. But the key thing is dipping into that color palette and coming up with a color palette that makes more sense and helps underscore the story we're trying to tell. So instead of like blue, yellows, and reds, which seems kind of arbitrary, or reds and blues that suggest more hot and cold than turbulent or non-turbulent skies. Now I was thinking, what color represents turbulence? And my first port of call was the puke emoji. So there you go. You got a color ramp from stable gray to super pukey green. And in a nutshell, that's my job as a designer, to make things pukier in a good way. A couple other examples of color palettes in action for a map about illegal fishing activity around the globe. I took my color cues from fish. On those maps of bombing in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, I needed like thousands and thousands of little starbursts on a green field vegetation background. And green's a hard background color to work with when you're trying to show different levels of data on top of it. So on a walk with my dog, I found the answer in my neighbor's garden. And sometimes the answer to any data visualization process is literally under your nose. So on these maps of historic shipping routes in the age of sail, steam, and diesel, I found my color inspiration on my favorite flannel shirt. This is the page grid, underlies every single graphic in Atlas of the Invisible. Pretty standard. One of my favorite things, though, it's a little like designer nerd out thing. It's like I always, on every book, like to come up with a new way of designing the page numbers with folios. And on this one, because I didn't want the folios to ever be in the way down in areas where like key parts of a map or graphic are happening, I tucked them up in the upper corners with this diagonal thing. And I think that's kind of neat because if you ever, I always turn in the corners of pages when I find my place in a book or bookmark a page, and we've got the fold line already built into the graphic for me. But sometimes visualizations we're working on kind of like outgrow the confines of this grid. So I just turn the book. So in the case where I wanted to give you a portrait of Greenland and really help you see the ice melting off Greenland's ice sheet, I created this vertical centerfold of sorts, unadorned with any label or clutter, just letting you really see Greenland, a place that often isn't visible to us, but should be. And sometimes graphics need even more space than that. So we've got 4 gatefolds in the book when the maps I'm making just need some room to spread out. Now, people often ask where we get our ideas for our graphics and the different visual ways we tell stories in the book. And I'd like to stress that our process always starts by asking the question of what story we want to tell. We start off with a topic that we come across or are interested in. We go looking for what data is out there on the subject. We start thinking about, what slice of it. Usually data sets are really big and have many different variables and we can't show all of them. So what slice of this story do we want to tell? And it's only then that we begin thinking about the appropriate form for the story we're trying to tell. For example, map projections give us infinite ways of viewing our spherical Earth. We can flatten it onto the page in many different ways. Here are some that show up in the book, like the Pierce quincuncial projection that allows us to take our spherical Earth and turn it into a square, which you'll see tessellated on our book's end papers in just gold and red, another favorite feature of mine in the book. But the one example I want to point you to now is this one down the center bottom. And this is a projection created by a guy named Athelton Spillhouse, which really comes in handy when you have a map where the story is focused on the world's oceans. Again, such as this example about illegal fishing activity around the world. Long lining fishing boats, that trail these long lines of hooks behind them. That activity largely takes place on the high seas. And so if we want to show that, we use this projection that allows us just to isolate the Pacific Ocean as one contiguous mass and then show the Atlantic and the Indian separately on the facing page. Sometimes we just got to make the map ourselves. So this is one looking at the UN's annual World Happiness Report. And I decided to build the continents out of all these little faces in a technique known as Chernoff faces. Well, it's a mix, actually. It's a bubble map made up of Chernoff faces. And what Chernoff faces are is a way of taking multiple variables in a data set and assigning each one to a different facial feature. So in this case, the size of the head corresponds to the country's GDP. The aura behind it, either a sunny yellow or a gloomy purple, represents how respondents to the survey rated their overall life satisfaction. The eyes correspond to whether or not people felt negative feelings like anger, sadness, or worry the day before. And the mouth then tracks with whether or not people felt positive feelings the day before, like happiness or laughter or joy. And non-surprisingly, a lot of war-torn areas, Afghanistan and Yemen, are the gloomiest, and some areas that are quite equitable, like Scandinavia, are the sunniest. Sometimes our visual forms start with a sketch like this one, where we knew for our climate change chapter, we wanted to look at the Hajj and how the Hajj in its current form may be unsustainable in certain years in the future. So we plotted this solar calendar of the dates of the Hajj for the entire 21st century, from 2000 to 2100. And because the Hajj follows a lunar calendar and occurs 11 days earlier each year, the dates kind of circle around in a different position around this calendar, with each petal here of this sunflower representing a different month. And from August to October, you've got a lot of humid air that blows in off the Red Sea. And when that mixes with withering inland heat, you get extreme heat stress events happening. And Hajj, which on its second day requires Hajis to walk many, many miles in direct sunlight, really at risk of extreme heat stress, especially elder participants. So we wanted to create this so you and your family are planning your Hajj at some point in the future. Maybe you want to take this into account and plan your trip for years that aren't, it's not going to occur in August to October. Wonder how many attendees tonight have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. The personal tracking data has been around for years. And this is a graphic from our London book back in 2014. It was looking at an app called Strava. And we just took 1 hour of rush hour from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m., 7 a.m. colored blue, and then progressing to orange at 8 a.m. to look at people cycling, using the Strava app to track their cycling routes into central London. And when we were looking at talking about personal tracking for the current book, Alice and the Invisible, well, I took inspiration from my own home, where my wife, Sophie, was wearing a Fitbit for the entire year of 2018. So we took her sleep data and her steps data, and I created what I call an eyelash chart. The x-axis of the chart following the contours of her eyelids, and even the blue bars hanging down off of that show her stages of light sleep, deep, and REM sleep each day. Now, it was not surprising that she didn't get much sleep on a red-eye flight, or that she got lots of sleep after taking a big hike. But what was surprising to us was that it recorded that every night she wakes up with these little micro bits of sleep that add up, and totaling maybe an hour every night. So we realized from this data that if she wants to get 8 hours of sleep, she really should be in bed for 9. And sometimes data collection like this has unintended consequences. One of the more well-known of those was back in 2018 when Strava released a world map of all their user activity to sort of market and promote the benefits to Strava for tracking your exercise. What they didn't quite realize was that the US military had a lot of people who were using Strava to track their jogs. And in 2018, a researcher from Australia zoomed in on some dark spots on the world map and realized that the Pentagon had essentially doxed themselves. So here you've got the Strava records of a Bagram Air Force base in Afghanistan, where basically, this one is a known Air Force base, but there were many other secret military bases that were now showing up just because they were recording where soldiers were jogging all around the base. In some cases, you could even see helicopters and planes taking off with an active Strava app still on in the plane's cockpit. Of course, there are many uses where data can be used for good, and one of them is just up the road from Ann Arbor in Flint, Michigan. We've got an incredible story here in our book that began in Literati bookstore, at least as far as my involvement with it. I was back in Ann Arbor visiting family and friends, and stopped by Literati and was upstairs in the cafe, and I ran into the University of Michigan researcher and friend Eric Schwartz, and I asked him what he was doing. And he said, well, I've been working on the Flint water crisis, seeing if we can use some data analysis to help out and get to the bottom of the problem there. He said, that's perfect for this new book I'm working on. I'd love to be able to work with you to help visualize your research. And over the next couple of years, we collaborated in creating these maps, which show up in the book, showing that the key to solving Flint's water crisis was to trust data over digging. What Eric and Jake and his colleagues did was they created this model by working with officials in Flint's government to build a model incorporating old city records of the value of homes, the locations of homes, the size of homes, the price of homes. And by feeding all that into a model, they could train an algorithm to predict which parcels of land in the city of Flint were more at risk of having lead or galvanized pipes underground, invisible, out of sight, and which ones were more likely to have safer materials. So on the map on the left, which we're looking at, our greener areas we said are safer, and the browner areas have higher risk of having lead or galvanized pipes. And then an interesting thing happened that really I think is quite damning. In 2016, 2017, the city adopted the University of Michigan model. They went out there, and anywhere the model said that there was a home at risk, they would dig, and they 70% of the time, at a pretty successful hit rate, they'd find lead and they'd replace it. But then a lot of people who lived in areas on the periphery that were outside of the model's vision of things, they wanted the peace of mind of knowing that their homes were safe too, and they didn't really trust the data. They wanted their yards dug up and their pipes checked as well. Well, at enormous taxpayer expense, the city decided to pivot and bow to that public pressure. So in 2018, they went around and started block by block just digging up parcels, and the hit rate dropped all the way down to 15%. So at the end of that year, realizing what a waste of money and mistake that was, turned back to the data-driven model, and the hit rate went back up to 58%. Now, the real smoking gun for me is this image, which we show on a second page in the book. On the left, you've got what the model predicted, and on the right, what was actually found. And it's, for the most part, a one-to-one lineup. Green areas that they thought were safe turned out to be safe. Brown areas that they thought were at risk turned out to be at risk. I'm going to give you two more examples tonight, and then we can open it up for Q&A. And sometimes, especially if you're a student or someone working on data visualizations yourself, presentations like these can make it seem like we got everything right on the first try, and that's hardly the case. When you're working on a project for 4 years, false starts and dead ends are just part of the design process. So I'm going to show you an example of a story that had multiple false starts. We came across this incredible database about made by researchers on 4 continents, looking at old shipping logs and historical documents to compile a database of some 36,000 voyages across the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade, and then another 11,400 voyages within the Americas. And as we started sifting through this database, there's so many different variables to work with. What one slice of this massive story were we possibly going to tell in our book? And initially, I was looking at temporal change, from when the trade started to when the trade ended, which countries were involved. We start to see these relationships. Portugal is really involved. Britain is really involved. But the data was showing that Spain wasn't that involved. And I knew that wasn't true. But what this data is really looking at is the flag that was flying over the ship when it crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And I knew something was up, because even though the Spanish flag wasn't flying over the ships, I knew Spain was more involved. And I also felt like this visualization looked pretty lame, and there was something else we could do. So then we started looking at mapping it, looking at flows from ports of embarkation in Africa to ports of disembarkation in the Americas. And there's 2 problems that showed up here. One more basic, data viz problem is that it's easier to read flows, at least for us as Western readers, going from left to right. But the flow across the Atlantic Ocean was going from right to left. The other bigger, more consequential problem, in my view, was that many of the most complicit importers in this database were tiny Caribbean islands that completely disappear from view when you take this sort of global scale view of things. And I thought, anytime you try and map transatlantic slave trade data, you're really letting some of these more complicit tiny island nations or colonies off the hook. And I wanted to show the true scale of complicity with our visualization. So we decoupled all the data from a traditional map, and I started making what's called a Sankey diagram. Now, this is by far the most complex Sankey flow diagram I've ever worked on, and I think I've ever seen. This complete spaghetti tangle of lines that, once I came up with the custom code for all the different values, port of embarkation, region of embarkation, passage, disembarkation, yada, yada. It creates this whole mess, which you can't even see here. This is just a cropped in view of it that I'm marking up to try and make sense of and consolidate and yada, yada. And when I realized this, like in this case, color was part of the problem. Color on all these flows was just making more of a mess of things. So in the final iteration that showed up in the book, I stripped all the color back and just emphasized here on the first spread, which shows the transatlantic middle passage, the main region of disembarkation, which was in this case, Brazil. Of the 10.7 million captives who managed to survive the middle passage, nearly half disembarked in Brazil, which growing up in the United States and learning about the United States' role in the slave trade, I had no idea about what was happening in South America and just the scale of things. That's part of what we wanted to share here. But then there's this like second, less talked about trade that happened in the Americas, which we show on the next spread. And this is about another 11,400 voyages that took place with a good, I think, 10% or so of the many millions that made a second voyage in the Americas to another point in the Americas, got on board in Jamaica. And this is where Spain comes back into the story. Spain was basically paying other nations to import labor for them. After disease ravaged the Amerindian population in the early 1500s, they went looking for labor elsewhere. So the flags of other countries like Portugal and Britain may have been flying over the ships that were crossing the Atlantic, but Spain was more than willing to then buy captives and labor in ports in the New World and then ferry them on to the Spanish Americas, Cuba, Rio de la Plata down in Argentina and Puerto Rico. And the last graphic I want to end with tonight, before we get into the Q&A, we say our book is about maps and graphics that will change how you see the world. Perhaps I can change the way you view the United States, or at least you're part of it. So this is a graphic called the United Commutes, and it looks at some research that is just looking at our commuting patterns. It's looking at where we live and where we work. And if you draw a line between these two for many thousands of people, you get these clustering patterns of all these residences and workplaces connected together. And you take all that data and you put it through a clustering algorithm, and you say, define 50 different clusters in the United States. You can redraw the United States based on where we actually spend our time. So for instance, I grew up in Philadelphia, and anyone who lives in Southeast Pennsylvania will tell you that Pittsburgh is not in the same state. It may be within the border we draw that we call Pennsylvania, but it's not. The Appalachian Mountains are this extreme barrier, and that bears out with the data here, where Pittsburgh ends up being more clustered with Ohio and the Midwest, whereas Philadelphia and Southeast Pennsylvania clusters more with Delaware and Southern New Jersey. There's many other examples. For instance, in Michigan, the Toledo War, the Ohio-Michigan rivalry goes all the way back to at least the Toledo War in 1836. And based on commuting data, Toledo is still more connected with Michigan than it is with Ohio. So take that. The UP, on the other hand, they're completely on their own. They're not even connected with Wisconsin when it comes to where people live and work, it seems. Maybe in the Q&A, I can zoom in on some more details if we have people from the South, or we want to talk about the Midwest. But I can also show you out west where I live, Los Angeles is its own territory altogether. I mean, we are not connected with San Diego, not at all, and definitely, not making regular trips up to San Francisco. So a giant state like California subdivides down into 7 microgeographies, just like Texas, same there. So anyone has a question, I can jump back to those slides and talk about them in more detail. But thank you. That's it for me for now, and can't wait to hear what questions you have.
Thank you, Oliver. And folks, I'll remind you, you can use the Q&A feature of the webinar to submit any questions that you have for Oliver about really anything you've seen tonight in the presentation. Oliver, could you go back to the Michigan? I think Michigan is all one zone there.
Yeah, let me do that and just try and navigate my screen share here. Yeah, we got the Toledo Strip, right there.
Yeah.
A bit, but basically the lakes create this real self-enclosed state here. Now, the researchers who supplied us the data, in their paper, they came up with these imaginary names for these 50 new states. And interlocks, between the lakes is what they came up with for the Lower Peninsula.
And I'm sure you mentioned it, but I've just forgot. So what is the data that they're compiling here to create these?
It's really simple. It's just looking at where people live and where people work. If you
see
those commuting patterns, you put that through a clustering algorithm, and you say generate 50 clusters. If they said
right.
They said generate 15 clusters, the map would look different. But the conceit here was like, what would 50 states look like if we just based it on commute?
Like live, work, commute, basically, essentially. Yeah. I see. Yeah. No, it's interesting because it's interesting to see Berrien County in Michigan, which is the extreme southwest corner of Michigan, be part of Indiana, when I would assume it would be part of, I know Chicagoans often go to what they call Michiana for vacation, but from my experience, Sandburg would extend all the way up into Berrien County, Michigan. So I'm fascinated by that being contiguous with.
Is Michigan City right on the border?
Yes, Michigan City is right on the border, and then 1 mile up 94 is New Buffalo, which is the first exit on 94 in Michigan.
Maybe Michigan City is just the edge of Sandburg there, but
yeah, no, it's cool. This is the area that I was very interested in seeing how the divisions broke down, and then refamiliarizing myself with what the clustering was. So that's why this book is so fascinating. We have some questions coming in. Sure. A viewer writes, was that early slide of Boston produced by the Harvard Grid program, the first GIS?
Yeah, it was a program called SciMap. Yep.
Awesome. Susan writes, hi, Oliver, you just answered my question about the names of the community map. Super interesting. So yeah, they came up with these sort of new state names that are sort of, I guess, although I want to know where Entrelacs, in the lakes or something like that, between the lakes. Yeah.
Laurentide is after the glacier that
right.
Scoured through the area. Twain down there in Missouri. Franklin, of course, in Philadelphia.
Corntassel you could rename after I grew up in Coralville, Iowa, which is named after the fact that it's been discovered that under the Great Plains were coral reefs from billions of years ago. I'm wondering if you could talk about, how you decided what you would. I'm always interested to know for books like these, if there's like a lot of projects that could be included, or a lot of various things that you could. There's stuff on the cutting room floor, I would imagine, right? Like maybe things that didn't necessarily make it into the book. Am I mistaken there?
No, not at all. I mean, over the 4 years working on this, probably about 50% of the ideas we had in our, we have this running list workflow where we, initial idea, and then it slowly moves across our screen going through these different columns.
Yeah.
Probably 50% of the ideas that were initially in the idea column never made it into the final book for various reasons. It turned out to be crap ideas or in other cases, like there was a graphic we wanted to do on international arms trading, and there was another one on gun violence, and it just became like editorially thought, it's just out of balance, it's too heavy. We wanted to keep, how to draw the line somewhere, and
so that's actually
we thought were important, but we want to have a balance. Yeah.
It's interesting to talk about that from an editorial standpoint. So there's a sense in which data viz can be well, could be ideological, and sometimes it's useful to have it be ideological. But how do you draw these distinctions between? I mean, and I think in a lot of like social sciences, these visualizations are useful to sort of reify a concept, not to sort of like do bad science and sort of say like I'm just going to try to fudge the way this looks to sort of prove my point, but that these things would sort of open up understandings you think about like Thomas Sarici's origins of the urban crisis using redlining maps from the city of Detroit to sort of help people visualize the way in which segregation was sort of encoded in maps and visualizations. But you're making a book that's sort of like directed at, you know, all sorts of audiences, lay audiences and stuff like that too. And so I'm curious to know how it would seem like these things necessarily editorialized, but what is too much editorializing, and what do you want to communicate through the book that's, you know, not, I guess, like you say, too heavy. I'd be interested to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, right on. I mean, anytime you choose to devote time and energy to a topic and to include it in a collection like this, you're introducing a bias because, you know, you've deemed that topic worthy of your time and efforts. So just including it alone is you know, putting your finger on the scale a little bit. I think part of the way we handle that in the book is by having our discrete chapters.
Right.
And we're trying to create a balance of topics, right, that flow and show the range of things that are out of view, underground, you know, lost to history, you know, out of scale, that we can use data to visualize. And that's really the thesis of the book, is like showing the power of data viz and graphics to reveal things that text and photos can't show you. And as long as we're hewing to that and we're showing you something that's happening, that's true,
right,
and we're being dedicated to the research, you know, I feel it belongs in the book. You know, the first chapter, Where We've Been, looks at data digitization projects from the past and looking at all these efforts to go back, like in slave trade graphics, you know, going back, looking at historical records and what can we learn again about the past and see in a new way by taking historical records and applying contemporary data viz techniques. The second chapter in the book, Who We Are, really looks at a lot of census data and the cell phone data and things, and looks at ways in which we can maybe review. That's where this commuting pattern graphic lives. Looks at how we can review political boundaries, looks at maybe how we can have dynamic censuses, which are more affordable and give us a better idea of our populations and how our populations vary, say, after a natural disaster like Hurricane Maria that, you know, wiped through Puerto Rico. By using mobile phone data, we can like get a sense of how many people were impacted rather than waiting for like the next decennial census to come around. The third chapter then looks, you know, an opportunity to look at truth to power and invisible inequalities.
Right.
And then our fourth chapter, you know, it becomes a holding ground for all the graphics we want to put together, looking at climate change and what science can tell us about where the planet's heading.
I mean, you mentioned perhaps uncharitably to yourself that there were projects or concepts that you had to job because they're quote unquote crap, but I'm wondering if there were any that were, you see a lot of data viz now that's, you know, New York Times just did something with sort of mapping how the SARS-CoV-2 virus fits in an aerosol, right? And like a complete 3D topography of that. So obviously there's stuff that's like very useful to new media, but I'm wondering if there was a project that was sort of abandoned because it was too difficult to capture on two dimensions. I think what's really lovely about this book and why I love these books is that you can pour over them and spend a lot of time with them. And I like that they're analog. But I wonder if there were some that, what are like the upper limits of how ambitious you can be, sort of like maybe like making like a pop-up feature in the book or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there was anything that we couldn't do because it was analog. It's more that I treat um, the constraints, if you want to call them constraints, of a printed page as opportunities, design opportunities. So, for instance, the gutter, it can often be devil a book project. I see as this great tool if you want to compare two things. You can put one on the left page, one on the right page, and this gutter gives you this natural mirror that you just instinctively are comparing two things across that. Similarly, these gatefolds in the book, the Vietnam story that we tell, looking at bombing at the regional level in Southeast Asia, then zooming in on Cambodia, and then zooming in on one particular battle in Vietnam. I can control the reader's experience by having this gatefold. And so that the flap first starts off with that regional scale, then you open it up, zooms in, then you turn the page again and it jumps down into the most local battle scale level. And as a designer, I love being able to control that end-to-end experience, and everything you need is there without any pinching, zooming, or browser updates.
So your first books, putting aside our lovely Notes from a Public Typewriter, Where the Animals Go, and Information Capital, are kind of topic specific in a way, right? And with this book, you're really broadening out so you can include, like you said, there's this sort of flow of, there's a central thesis of the book, but you can kind of go through a lot of different projects and a lot of different kinds of concepts or ideas of layouts to sort of get to that point. And so I'm curious to know if you and James have another project in the works, or this is this like sort of is Atlas of the Invisible kind of like a preview of similar kind of like omni-inclusive projects to come? Have you guys been talking about what you might like to do next in the book, in a book form?
Yeah, sure. We've been talking about some upcoming ideas, upcoming projects that we would author. Still very nascent, but we are already about a third of the way through doing maps and graphics for an Atlas of Finance that we are not authoring. It's authored by economists from the University of Oxford, but they reached out to us to bring it to life with all the visuals. And so that's just a nice change of pace for us, because we just get to focus on, not so much the topic data angle, portion of it, though we're in conversation with them about what are the stories to tell and how best to do it. But we really get to dive in on just the design aspect of it. And like, I had this vision from the beginning of the project to really make it all look like international banknotes and bring in a lot of texture and typography, going back to like 19th century banknotes and stuff. And it's turning out really well. So I know that's going to come out in a few years. But, demystifying the financial world, which I knew nothing about, and now I'm knowing a little more.
Yeah, that's awesome. We'll be excited for that. And then there's just one more comment here I'll wrap up with, from one of our viewers who writes, Oliver, I admire your design work so much. And as a fellow stamps grad, having seen how far you've come since your undergrad days, you are a gift to humanity. Well, Oliver Uberti, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Home with Literati. It's such a treat to be taken inside the work that goes into this incredible book. And for viewers who haven't seen it, it's a beautiful object as well. Might I say, on December 2nd, a perfect gift for the holidays, to anyone who like me grew up poring over these kinds of things all night. So please do check it out. There's links in the description if you're watching us on YouTube. There's of course links in the chat.
Tomorrow night's Midnight Madness.
That's right.
Going out to Literati.
So if you're in Ann Arbor, we'll have copies in the store as well. Oliver, thank you. We're looking forward to having you back in the store for for the next book. But we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. It's so great to see you. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us this evening at Home with Literati. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.